Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišak, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda. The NATO summit takes place on June 24-25 in The Hague. How should the North Atlantic Treaty Organization deal with American President Donald Trump? Can NATO work in a mode of pleasing and not provoking him? How should the alliance spend 5% of GDP on defense? And what to do with Russia? At the Globsec conference in Prague, I spoke with Ben Hodges, a former commanding general, United States Army Europe. Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate. The upcoming NATO summit will most probably agree on increasing defense expenditures to 5% of GDP. Let's see how it will work. Secretary General Marguta said it might be like 3.5 for hard defense and 1.5 for, let's say, related things. So, is this needed? And in your opinion, how to spend such money efficiently?
Yes, it's needed, of course. We're having to repair the damage that was done through neglect by all of us over the past 30-something years, both in terms of a mistaken belief that at the end of the Cold War, everybody was going to be peaceful and that Russia would never be a threat and we could all disarm. So even the United States dropped about 90% of its presence in Europe because we thought we wouldn't need this anymore. So that was a mistake. And also all of us, including soldiers from Slovakia and the Czech Republic and other parts of Eastern Europe, fought alongside of us in Iraq and Afghanistan and were part of that. And that was a different kind of war. So when you think over 20 years of that, you lose a generation of experience on how to conduct large-scale conventional warfare like we see in Ukraine. So there is a need to invest in deterrence. We know from thousands of years of history that the best way to prevent a conflict is to demonstrate that you're ready for it. And it's much cheaper to do that than to have to fight as we see in Ukraine. But I think the other part of your question, how to spend it. Okay, so this 5%, and by the way, when I was a lieutenant in the 80s, almost everybody, including Germany, was at 5% or more. I mean, that was the norm. So our political leaders have got to explain to the population, to the taxpayers, why this is necessary. Okay, and taxpayers deserve to hear why we have to do this. And so our leaders have to be courageous enough to explain it to their fellow citizens. Now, what do you spend it on? So the 3.5% for so-called hard defense, this is what, when you think of defense investments, whether it's modernizing equipment, ammunition, growing the size of your force, all those kinds of things. And then 1.5%, and I think this is a good idea, it's necessary, is for cyber protection, infrastructure that is necessary for the military, so improved transportation, for example. These are things that will help with defense. So I like that. But at the top of everybody's list, of every minister of defense, every chief of defense, their first priority is readiness of their forces. Are you trained? Do you have the equipment you're supposed to have? All the formations fully manned with women and men, good soldiers? That's the first priority. That's where the money should go first. Modernization is only a part of that.
But do we have a personnel and do we have enough people that might be needed for such armed forces of the future we are trying to build with all those money?
The people are out there, but they're not in the army yet. I mean, will be a decision for each nation. How does each nation grow the size of its armed forces to meet its requirements, both for protection of the homeland, but also to fulfill obligations from the NATO regional defense plans to which every nation, including Slovakia, agreed. So you have to have enough Army and Air Force personnel to do all that. Now, I think whether a nation decides to go back to conscription or Germany the Wehrpflicht, or if it's all volunteer or is it some combination, that's a decision for each nation to make that's appropriate for culture, tradition, and resources. But I think government should encourage women and men to want to serve, that service in the military should be talked up as a positive thing, whether it's for 1 or 2 years or somebody wants a career. And I think probably there are a lot of young women that would like to serve, but maybe it's not seen as a appropriate or normal thing yet. Almost 20% of the U.S. Army is female. We don't have enough men that can meet the standard. And so we had to open up more for women, and they do fantastic. And so I think more and more European countries are realizing that there's an important and needed role for women in the armed forces that would help. And then finally, in the United States, citizenship and education, these are incentives for people to join the military. If you're already a legal immigrant, a green card holder in the U.S., you join the military, you're fast-tracked to citizenship. That's a powerful incentive. And of course, education in the U.S. is too expensive. So one of the incentives we give to people who join is pay for their education. A lot of people come in for that.
But you mentioned, of course, green card holders, and, we see what's going on in your country. Do you think that those incentives will stay?
First of all, it's awful what's happening. I can't explain how and why we got here, but that's where we are. And we have an administration now that I think has manufactured a crisis because this appeals to a part of the population. And there's no doubt that sovereignty of borders is important in every country. I'm not disputing that. I think that the way this administration is going about doing it and really misusing the military, using the military inappropriately, is unhelpful. Having said that, they won't be there forever. So this is a tradition. I mean, we've had immigrants fighting for the Army or the Navy from our beginning. And so I would expect that this is something that will continue. It may be disrupted for a while, but in the long run, everybody knows that we need it. Just like every farmer and construction company depends on undocumented labor. They'll tell you that. So our tradition has been legal immigrants, green card holders that join, and they're fast-tracked. I've seen ceremonies in Iraq where dozens of soldiers who had earned their citizenship did it while we were in Iraq. It's fantastic.
Ben, except for the debate about the increased military budgets, what do you expect from the NATO summit regarding how the alliance wants to deal with the current security environment, which is pretty challenging, I'd say?
Yeah. Well, of course, Secretary General Ruta has continued the good work of Secretary General Stoltenberg of keeping the alliance together despite all the different challenges, despite enormous interference and disinformation coming from Russia, trying to shatter the cohesion of the alliance. And frankly, some members of the alliance, including my own president, have not been very helpful on this cohesion. They talk openly about, NATO's this and that, but also even President Macron a few years ago said NATO was brain dead. And there were a lot of members of the alliance that were not doing what they should do in accordance with Article 3 of the Washington Treaty, which created NATO, which is every nation is responsible for providing enough for their own defense and to be able to help others. So I think, and President Trump, to be fair, is correct. And like all of his predecessors, calling out allies for not doing what they should be doing. So I think what Secretary General Ruta is hoping for is, number one, like every summit, you want to come out of there with the cohesion unbroken. That even though nations will have huge arguments with each other, as has happened over the entire history of NATO, that you would have huge debates between nations about policies and grievances or whatever. The thing that made NATO what it was so successful at doing, at deterring Russia, was there was no doubt that we were all together. As we showed after 9/11, when all the nations of the alliance came together to support the United States after we were attacked on 9/11. The only time Article 5 has ever been invoked. Okay? So cohesion is number one. Number two, disagreement on increased spending, the 5%. I think my sense is that this will come out of that. Not everybody's going to be thrilled with it. The UK just came out and said 2.3%. They're really proud of that, but they'll have to, okay, Canada finally getting to 2%. They'll have to keep moving, keep increasing. But I think that will be the signature thing of this summit. The third, and this would be my final point, is I think everybody's holding their breath a little bit that President Trump doesn't come in and blow it up. I expect and I hope that he will show up and take credit for everybody increasing defense spending. And frankly, most of the European leaders are savvy enough and mature enough to say, fine, please, thank you, Mr. President, for you inspired us to do this. Just don't leave. Don't leave. Don't wreck the cohesion of the alliance. Now, what's kind of in the context of this entire summit, of course, is Ukraine. And President Zelensky has been invited, so I expect he'll be there. I think that the fact that the United States has wavered in its support for Ukraine is a real problem, and this will be a big discussion point. Hopefully, the other leaders of the alliance will pressure the American president, say, look, this is important. You can't take the side of Russia because of the threat Russia is to all of us in Europe.
So you mentioned that everybody will be looking at President Trump, and of course, no doubt, no matter what kind of president in the White House, the U.S. is a backbone of the alliance. It's very crucial to have U.S. in Europe. But I read headlines really like NATO will try to please Mr. Trump, will try to not to provoke Mr. Trump. Do you think that alliance can work in such a mode, pleasing and not provoking Trump?
That's a terrible approach. And I think more and more leaders are starting to realize, there is the possibility when they look at how President Trump interacts with the Russians, his economic approach with tariffs against all of our allies. So I think that as we saw for the visit of the German Bundeskanzler Merz to the White House here a couple of weeks ago, that was impressive. And Mr. Merz went in there. Of course, he was clever enough to bring the birth certificate, which reminded the whole world that Trump is grandson of immigrants. That was genius, a personal connection nonetheless. And Merz, he's a finance guy. He's a business guy. He understands economics better than does the American president. Plus, he's a golfer. He's fit. He's a big, tall guy. So he went in there confident. And also, he knew that he had already made it clear that Germany was going to increase its defense spending. And so took that off the table as an issue. And now they can argue about policy, about car tariffs and stuff like that. And, BMW exports more cars from America than any American car company, which is, that. And so you get past the front page and you see how intertwined we are. My point is, European leaders should feel very confident in dealing with the American president. He respects it, I think, more when you stand up to him, rather than try to go in there and brown nose. To me, that's the worst approach to deal with a bully, is to brown nose, to give in. Now, every national leader's first responsibility is his or her country, to protect the interests of his or her country. But I would counsel going in there, and the same goes for the alliance. Look, do what you're supposed to do. Don't whine or suck your thumb. Do what you're supposed to do, which is your contribution to the collective security of 32 nations. That's the best way to prevent a conflict with Russia or anybody else.
So how much you share concerns that, especially if Russia is at least partly successful in Ukraine, how much do you share concerns that Moscow might be willing to attack a NATO country, or at least to test our resolve? Because we hear those concerns. And for example, it's very interesting. We hear this from Germans all the time. So it seems that, and they know what they're doing. They know the Central Europe. They know the Eastern Europe. So how much do you share those concerns?
100%. I don't doubt it for a second. I mean, the Russians talk about it all the time. There's 2 or 3 aspects of this. It won't be, in my view, let's say worst case that Ukraine somehow capitulates or they lose half of the country. And then Russia says, okay, good. We've got all the Black Sea coast, including Odessa. And now we're in Moldova. Okay. They're not going to wait 5 years after that to rebuild and then start all over again. I think their objective when it comes to NATO is different than what it is when it comes to Ukraine. Their objective with regards to NATO is to break the alliance. And they do that by attacking say, Latvia or Lithuania or somewhere, establishing, taking part of it and then stopping and say, you guys, do you really want to have a nuclear war over Daugavpils? Something like that. That's I think the more likely scenario. They will attack. If they've made that decision, that means they've already made the decision to destroy transportation infrastructure with attacks like we see in Ukraine now, because they know we depend on rapid reinforcement. So this would be a bad situation. But I also think that we should be aware that they're at war with us already. President Pavel said this yesterday, that in his opening speech, that the Russians are continuously contesting, pressing at conflict. They just use different tools. Sometimes it's disinformation, sometimes it's sabotage, sometimes it's violations of airspace. It's a constant struggle. So they're at war with us. We don't think like that in the West. We're like, oh, come on, no, this is peace. And even Commissioner Kobelius yesterday, he said there's wartime, peacetime, wartime, and right now we're sort of ready for defense time. People are trying to figure out, what do you call this? I think this is something the alliance is going to have to address. And the EU also is to figure out, how do you stop or deter Russia's disruption operations before they get to the point where they think they could actually go into a NATO country.
If you look at the current situation on the battlefield in Ukraine, how would you assess the Russian offensive, if we can call it offensive?
Well, I hear Russian offensive all the time, but really all it is just more unlucky troops get pushed into the meat grinder as they try to drown Ukrainian defenders in Russian corpses. I think that unless there is some significant external thing that happens that changes things, this war a year from now will probably look like it does right now. The Ukrainians are not going to stop. They can't. They can't stop. This is about survival. And actually, they can see that Russia cannot win. The only chance that Russia has is if the West turns their back on Ukraine. But unfortunately, because we in the West have failed to clearly describe our strategic outcome as we want Ukraine to win, to respect the sovereignty of Ukrainian territory, we have not given what they needed. We have not helped them in an overwhelmingly decisive way. It didn't happen during the Biden administration, and it's getting worse now with the Trump administration. So the chances of Ukraine, in the absence of something significant changing, will not be able to push Russia back out. Although I think they're going to continue doing things like the Operation Spiderweb. They're going to keep going after that Kerch Bridge. They're going to keep going after Russian oil and gas infrastructure. But I think ultimately the only thing that will get Russia to the negotiating table is economic pain. And that means shutting down their ability to export oil through the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea to China and India, and to wreck their infrastructure. And also, I think probably in the markets somehow to get the cap on what Russia does export, so that financially they just can't continue.
Are you worried? And of course, what we have seen, what's going on the Middle East, it's a big thing. We have to pay attention to it. But are you somehow worried that conflict in the region might somehow distract us from helping Ukraine?
I don't know that something that like what Germany's doing now, or Poland or France, or Sweden, what they're doing to help Ukraine, that would change if something happened in the Middle East. I mean, the U.S. unfortunately has already, Secretary of Defense Hegseth said that, we're not going to provide anything else to Ukraine. We'll see. But all of these things are connected somehow. Iran has no friends in the world except Russia. And I always felt that if we helped Ukraine defeat Russia, then it would leave Iran more isolated and less able to do what it's doing. But as long as Russia stays in the fight, that helps Iran. So I don't think we've been very clever strategically thinking about this. I could never say that there's no impact. Of course there is, but maybe there's also opportunity.
And one last thing. So despite the ongoing negotiation, do you think that we will have war and the war will continue?
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also the description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.